Luke Harris sat in his favorite armchair, the one by the large bay window overlooking their quiet suburban street. It was a typical evening, and he was reading a new software development book he had ordered, a routine that helped him wind down after a long day at work. His mind was still processing lines of code when Evelyn entered the room, her presence filling the space with a familiar comfort. She smiled, but there was something about it, something lukewarm that didn't quite match her usual warmth. "Hey Luke, I'll be in the kitchen making dinner. How about you help me set the table?" Evelyn's voice was soft, almost distracted as she set her bag down by the door. Luke looked up from his book, offering a smile in return. But as he glanced at his wife, he noticed something was off. Her eyes seemed distant, unfocused, as though her mind was somewhere far away. It wasn't the first time he'd noticed a shift in her behavior. Over the past few weeks, Evelyn had become increasingly withdrawn. She came home later and later from her teaching job, often making vague excuses about meetings or extra work. When they spoke, she would glance at her phone, her fingers swiping across the screen in a way that seemed almost automatic, as if she were checking something that needed her constant attention. He shrugged it off, figuring it was just a rough patch. After all, they'd been married for 15 years, long enough to know that relationships went through cycles. Perhaps Evelyn was just stressed, trying to balance her demanding job and the household responsibilities. Maybe it was just a phase. Dinner that night was uneventful, the conversation light, though there was a noticeable gap between them. Mia and Jack, their 2 children, were busy with their schoolwork in the other room, leaving Luke and Evelyn alone for a rare quiet moment. As they ate, Luke couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. Evelyn seemed to be retreating into herself more and more, and no matter how hard he tried to talk to her, it felt as if she was miles away. That night, as they got ready for bed, Evelyn was unusually quiet. Luke's mind raced, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. When they crawled into bed, he reached over to pull her close, but she flinched just enough to make him stop mid-motion. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice gentle but filled with concern. Evelyn paused as if she were weighing her words carefully. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just tired," she replied, but her voice lacked conviction. Luke didn't press the issue. He let it slide, hoping it was just another one of those moments. He knew they both had their own battles. His with the pressures of work and hers with the relentless demands of her job and motherhood. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. It wasn't the physical distance that bothered him most, it was the emotional gap that had started to grow, subtle yet undeniable. The days that followed only amplified his worries. Evelyn continued to come home later than usual, always seeming to have an excuse. She spent more time on her phone, and when she wasn't doing that, she was staring into space, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. There were days when she was so distant that Luke could hardly remember what it felt like to be close to her. One evening, as Evelyn was preparing for a parent-teacher meeting at school, Luke found himself watching her more closely. Her movements were hurried, her gestures stiff, as if she was trying to rush through the motions. She didn't seem to care about the little things she once did, like making sure Mia and Jack had everything they needed for school the next day. It was all slipping through the cracks. "Evelyn," Luke called from the living room as she grabbed her keys and jacket. "Can we talk?" She hesitated for a moment, then turned to face him. "Not tonight, Luke. I'm already late," she said, her tone tinged with something he couldn't quite place. Irritation? Impatience? Or was it something else? Luke stood there, feeling a knot tighten in his stomach. He watched as she walked out the door, the sound of her heels clicking down the hallway, a sound that felt both familiar and alien. The door clicked shut behind her, and the silence that followed seemed deafening. Later that night, as the house grew still and quiet, Luke found himself alone with his thoughts, unable to let go of the gnawing feeling in his chest. His mind wandered, remembering all the small changes in Evelyn's behavior. There was a distance between them that hadn't been there before, a growing divide that seemed impossible to ignore now. It wasn't until a few days later that his suspicions started to crystallize. Luke had come home early from work, hoping to surprise Evelyn with a quiet evening. But as he opened the door, he heard her voice, soft, almost tender, coming from the kitchen. The conversation wasn't directed at him, but at someone else. Luke froze, listening as Evelyn spoke in a way that he had never heard before. "I miss you, Ben. I can't stop thinking about you," she said. The words hit Luke like a punch to the gut. His breath caught in his throat as the reality of what he had just overheard sank in. He didn't know who Ben was, but it didn't matter. The intimacy in Evelyn's voice, the longing he heard, it wasn't something that belonged to their marriage. Frozen in place, Luke's mind raced. Who was Ben? Was he someone from school? Someone she had been spending more time with? His thoughts spiraled, and before he could stop himself, he walked away from the door, retreating to the safety of his thoughts. The room felt suffocating as the truth, unspoken but painfully clear, loomed in the air. Everything in him wanted to confront Evelyn right then and there, but he knew he had to wait. This was no longer about the small, nagging doubts he'd been trying to ignore. This was something much bigger. When Evelyn returned that evening, the air between them felt heavy. Luke wanted to ask her, to demand answers, but he didn't. Not yet. He needed to process what he had overheard, to understand the full extent of the betrayal that was now unraveling before him. He waited for the right moment, but it didn't come that night. Evelyn, as if nothing had changed, kissed him on the cheek before heading to bed early, her eyes still distant, lost in thoughts of someone, or something else. The next few days were a blur of tension and silence. Luke tried to engage, tried to ask her about the strange distance between them, but Evelyn only deflected, offering excuses that felt more and more hollow. And then, on the 5th day, he couldn't take it anymore. He needed to know the truth. He approached her one evening, his voice steady but filled with a weight of emotion that had built up over the last few weeks. Evelyn, we need to talk. About Ben. I need you to tell me what's going on. Evelyn's face turned pale. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, her eyes searching his face, but she didn't speak right away. It was as if she knew that once the truth was spoken, everything would change. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she whispered, I've been seeing someone else, Luke. It's Ben. I'm sorry. The words hung in the air, suffocating him as his world began to crumble. Luke stood frozen, the words reverberating in his mind like an echo that refused to fade. I'm sorry. The phrase didn't even sound like it belonged in this conversation. It felt foreign, like a defense, an afterthought. Evelyn's eyes were filled with guilt, but the damage had already been done. I don't understand, Luke finally managed to say, his voice shaking despite his best efforts to hold it together. His hands trembled at his sides, unsure of whether he should reach for her or walk away. He felt a strange mixture of anger, confusion, and heartbreak clawing at his chest. How long, Evelyn? How long has this been going on? Evelyn looked down at her hands, the guilt radiating from her like a heavy cloud. It started a few months ago. At first, it was just work, you know? We were collaborating on a project at school. But then, I don't know. It just happened. She paused, her voice faltering. I never meant for it to go this far, Luke. I swear it wasn't supposed to be like this. Luke tried to take a deep breath, but the air felt too thick, too suffocating. How could you, Evelyn? His voice was almost a whisper now, the pain making it hard to speak. We've built everything together. Our family, our lives. How could you betray me like this? Evelyn's eyes welled up with tears, but she didn't look at him directly. I never wanted to hurt you. But I've been feeling so disconnected. Like I was just going through the motions. You've been so wrapped up in your work and I felt so alone. Ben, he made me feel seen. He listened. He cared in a way I didn't feel from you anymore. Luke's heart ached at her words, each one like a needle puncturing his chest. The truth stung, cutting deeper than any physical wound ever could. He wanted to scream, to lash out at her for what she had done, but there was something inside of him that just couldn't do it. He wasn't sure if it was because he still loved her or if it was because he didn't know how to let go of everything they had built. You should have come to me, Luke said, his voice tight. I would have listened, Evelyn. We could have worked through whatever this was. But you chose him over me. Over our family. Evelyn reached for him, but he stepped back, shaking his head. Don't touch me. The words came out harsher than he intended, but the hurt was too raw, too fresh. She pulled her hand back, her face crumpling in sorrow. I never wanted to hurt you, Luke. I didn't know how to talk about it. I didn't know how to fix it. Luke stood there, rooted to the spot, unsure of what to say or do next. His mind was racing, his heart a battlefield between the love he still felt for Evelyn and the overwhelming sense of betrayal that gnawed at him. I think we need some time apart, he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how to fix this, Evelyn. But I can't keep pretending like everything is fine when it isn't. Evelyn nodded silently, tears streaming down her face. She didn't try to argue or convince him otherwise. She knew deep down that there was no turning back from this moment. The damage had been done, and the weight of the truth hung heavily between them, separating them in a way that nothing could undo. As Luke turned and walked away, the silence in the house felt deafening. He knew there was no going back to the way things were before. Their marriage, their life together, had been shattered, and he had no idea how to pick up the pieces. In the following days, Luke found himself caught in a whirlwind of emotions. There were moments when the anger was overwhelming, moments when he would replay every conversation, every moment of their relationship trying to find the turning point, the moment when everything had changed. But there was no clear answer. The distance had grown slowly, quietly, until it had reached a point where it was too late to turn back. Meanwhile, Evelyn did her best to explain herself to Mia and Jack, though the words felt hollow in her mouth. She had hurt their father, and now they would bear the weight of that hurt. She tried to make them understand, tried to assure them that it wasn't their fault, but she couldn't shake the feeling that their family was broken beyond repair. For days Luke avoided Evelyn. He stayed at work longer than usual, coming home only to make sure the kids had what they needed. He tried to focus on the mundane tasks of daily life, but it was impossible to ignore the emptiness that now filled the space around him. The house that once felt like a home now felt like a prison. Every room reminded him of what had been lost, of the trust that had been shattered. One evening after the kids had gone to bed, Luke sat in the living room alone, staring at the family photos on the wall. There was a time when those pictures had meant everything to him. They were the moments of happiness, of love, of a life they had created together. But now each photo felt like a lie. He closed his eyes, trying to breathe through the pain. His heart felt heavy, like it was made of lead, weighing him down with each passing moment. He wanted to be angry, to yell and scream at Evelyn for what she had done. But he couldn't bring himself to do it. The anger felt so small in comparison to the grief, to the loss of something he had thought would last forever. In the days that followed, Luke made a decision. For the sake of their children, for the sake of their future, he would move forward. He would separate from Evelyn, not out of spite, but because he knew that staying together out of obligation would only cause more harm. The children needed stability, and Luke knew that it would be better for them to see their parents apart than to continue living in a house filled with tension and distrust. Evelyn didn't fight him on it. She knew as much as he did, that their marriage had reached its breaking point. They had both tried to hold on, but the cracks had become too deep to repair. And so, with heavy hearts, they began to navigate a new chapter of their lives. Separate but still tied together by their children, by the memories they had once shared, and by the painful lessons they would both carry forward. The weeks following the decision to separate felt like a blur to Luke. Each day seemed to pass in a haze of confusion and emotional exhaustion. He was functioning on autopilot, getting through the motions of his life but never fully present. The mornings were the hardest. Waking up in a quiet house without Evelyn beside him felt like a betrayal of everything they had once built together. Mornings that were once filled with laughter and the bustle of getting the kids ready for school had become eerily silent. Luke now found himself spending more time in his office, avoiding the reminders of their fractured family. His heart ached each time he looked at Mia and Jack, who had both begun to show signs of distress. Jack, usually the quiet one, had grown more withdrawn, while Mia seemed to be acting out in subtle ways, pushing boundaries, asking difficult questions about what was happening. Luke had always been the kind of father who wanted to shield his children from the harsh realities of life. But now he felt like he was failing them. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't pretend that everything was okay. He had to be honest with them, as painful as it was. One evening, as the kids sat on the couch, their eyes red from a long day, Luke gathered the courage to speak. "I know things have been hard lately, and I want you both to know that none of this is your fault. Your mom and I, we're not going to be living together anymore. But we're still a family and we're still going to be there for you. You're going to be okay." Mia wiped her eyes and nodded, but Luke could see the confusion in her expression. She was trying to make sense of the changes in her life, but the weight of the situation was too much for her young mind to process. Jack, on the other hand, sat silently, his gaze fixed on the floor. Luke hated the look of sadness in his son's eyes, knowing there was nothing he could say to take it away. The truth was, Luke didn't have all the answers. He was still trying to figure out how to navigate this new reality himself. He was still reeling from the betrayal, still processing the loss of his wife, not just as his partner but as the person he had thought he knew inside and out. The Evelyn he had fallen in love with, the one who had shared his dreams and ambitions, now felt like a distant memory. How could they come back from this? Was there even a way forward? Evelyn too was struggling in her own way. She had moved into a small apartment nearby, trying to start over, but the loneliness she felt there was overwhelming. She still found herself reaching for her phone at night, hoping for a message from Luke, even though she knew it was impossible. She missed him, missed the man she had loved, the father of her children. But the guilt of what she had done, the betrayal she had caused, weighed heavily on her. How could she face him now? How could she rebuild anything from the ashes of their marriage? She thought about Ben too. Their relationship had started so innocently, just a colleague, someone to talk to during long hours at school. But somewhere along the way it had crossed a line. She had let herself believe that Ben made her feel alive again, that he saw her in a way that Luke hadn't in years. She had felt like she was suffocating in her own marriage, like she was losing herself, and Ben had been her escape. But now, in the silence of her apartment, she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. Evelyn knew that the decision she had made had torn apart her family. But she also knew that the distance between her and Luke had been growing long before Ben had come into the picture. She had been feeling unappreciated, unnoticed, and the lack of communication between them had only pushed her further away. Still, the guilt lingered and she couldn't shake the feeling that she had thrown away something precious. As the days turned into weeks, Luke began to adjust to his new life, somewhat. He spent more time with Mia and Jack, focusing on their needs and trying to give them as much stability as he could. He signed them up for activities, took them to the park on weekends, and made sure they knew how much they were loved. But in the quiet moments, when they were tucked in bed or lost in their own world, Luke found himself thinking about Evelyn. His heart ached for what they had lost, and the pain of her betrayal still gnawed at him. Yet at the same time, he couldn't deny that he was beginning to feel a strange sense of freedom. For the first time in a long while, he was doing things for himself, without the weight of constantly trying to please someone else. One evening, as he was making dinner for the kids, he received a message from Evelyn. It was simple, just a few words. Can we talk? His heart skipped a beat. Despite everything, a part of him still wanted to hear her voice, to understand her side of things. But another part of him, the part that was still hurting, wanted to close that door forever. He stared at the message for a long moment, weighing his options. Finally, he took a deep breath and typed his response. Sure. When? Evelyn suggested meeting at a coffee shop the next morning. The place was small, cozy, and quiet. Exactly the kind of place where they had often gone for date nights before everything had gone wrong. The next morning, Luke arrived early, his stomach tight with nerves. He had no idea what to expect from this meeting, but he knew it was time to face Evelyn again. The questions he had been carrying, the ones that had kept him up at night, needed answers. He needed to know if they could ever move past this, or if it was truly the end of everything they had shared. When Evelyn arrived, she looked different. Her eyes were tired, her face drawn, but there was something in her posture that made Luke pause. She wasn't the woman he had confronted weeks ago. She seemed smaller somehow, as if the weight of everything she had done had taken its toll. Luke, she said softly, her voice trembling. I'm sorry. I know I can't undo what I've done, but I need you to know that I regret everything. I never wanted to hurt you. I don't know how we got here, but I'm so sorry. Luke's heart ached at the sincerity in her voice, but the pain of what had happened still lingered. I don't know if I can forgive you, Evelyn. Not right now, he said quietly. But I'm willing to talk. To listen. As they sat down together, the conversation unfolded in a way neither of them had expected. They spoke of their past, of their failures, of their regrets. But more than anything, they spoke of the future. Could they rebuild from this? Could they find a way forward, not as a married couple, but as co-parents, as individuals who had once loved each other deeply? It was the beginning of something new, not a resolution, not an easy fix, but the first step in navigating the path toward healing for both of them and for their children. The days after Luke and Evelyn's first conversation felt like a delicate truce, fragile and uncertain. Luke had agreed to meet with Evelyn, but he knew deep down that forgiveness wasn't something he could give away easily. The betrayal still stung, and the idea of rebuilding any kind of relationship seemed like an impossible task. He had no idea where to even begin. Each day, Luke's mind wandered back to the memories of their past. He thought about how they had once been so in tune with each other, how their conversations flowed effortlessly, how they had dreams and plans for the future. The sudden loss of that connection was still hard to comprehend. But there were moments when the clarity from their meeting with Evelyn lingered, when she admitted the pain of their disconnection, the silence that had festered in their marriage. Yet, despite her sincerity, Luke could not ignore the emotional wall that had been built between them. Her actions, her affair with Ben, left a scar that no apology could erase. Still, a small part of him wanted to believe that there was hope, that they could find their way back to something resembling the family they had once been. Days turned into weeks, and Luke continued to wrestle with his thoughts. He began taking long walks in the evenings after putting Mia and Jack to bed. The quiet solitude gave him time to think, to reflect, and to sort through his emotions. Each step felt heavy, as if he were physically moving through the grief. His heart was still broken, but there was a part of him that was starting to accept the reality of what had happened, even if he didn't know how to process it fully. Meanwhile, Evelyn was going through her own personal reckoning. After the conversation at the coffee shop, she found herself questioning everything: her choices, her actions, and the person she had become. She missed Luke more than she wanted to admit. But at the same time, she knew that what they had was broken, and it wasn't something she could fix with just an apology. She had tried reaching out to Ben after the separation, hoping for some clarity, hoping for the validation she had sought during her troubled marriage. But each time they spoke, she felt more lost. Ben had been an escape, a brief reprieve from her frustrations, but now the reality of what she had sacrificed for that momentary feeling of connection was becoming painfully clear. Ben wasn't the solution, not in the way she had hoped. Late one night, Evelyn sat in her small apartment, scrolling through old pictures of her family, trying to find a sense of peace. The pictures captured moments of joy, the birthdays, the vacations, the quiet nights they had spent together. It was hard to believe that it had all unraveled so quickly. Her phone buzzed with a message from Luke. Can we meet again? I've been thinking. Evelyn stared at the message for a long time, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She wanted to respond immediately, but fear held her back. What would they talk about? Could they even speak without the weight of their history and the pain of the past hanging over them? After a few minutes she typed back, yes. Let me know when. The next day they met once more, this time at a park near the kids' school. The air was crisp, the sky clear, and the golden leaves swirled in the breeze as if nature was offering a quiet reminder that time moves forward, whether they were ready or not. Evelyn arrived early, sitting on a bench and watching the world go by, her thoughts racing. She hadn't seen Luke like this in years, calm, collected, but with a sadness in his eyes that spoke volumes. When Luke finally arrived, he paused for a moment as if unsure of how to approach her. "Hey," Evelyn said softly, her voice tinged with vulnerability. "Hey," Luke replied, his voice steady but distant. He sat down beside her, but the space between them felt immense. They sat in silence for a few moments, each of them unsure of where to start. Finally Luke spoke. "I've been thinking a lot," he began, his gaze fixed on the path ahead. "About us. About what happened. And I realized something: I don't have all the answers. I don't know what the future holds or if we can go back to what we had. But I do know that I want to understand why this happened. I need to know what went wrong." Evelyn nodded slowly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I think I've known for a while what went wrong," she said quietly. "It wasn't just the affair, it was everything leading up to it. The distance, the silence. I felt like I was losing myself, like we were drifting further apart every day. And instead of facing it, I kept pretending it was fine. I didn't know how to ask for help. I didn't know how to reach out to you without feeling like I was failing." Luke listened intently, his heart heavy but understanding. "I never realized how much you were struggling. I thought I was doing the right thing, working hard, providing. But I wasn't really there, was I? Not the way you needed me." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. "You were always there, Luke. But I felt like I was doing everything alone. And when Ben came along, I convinced myself it was easier to escape than to face what was broken. I thought I could find something I was missing. But all I did was hurt you." Luke reached out and touched her hand, the gesture surprising them both. He didn't know what it meant, but in that moment, it felt like the only thing he could do. "I don't know if we can fix this, Evelyn. I really don't. But I do know that I don't want to keep living in this limbo. We owe it to ourselves and the kids to figure out what comes next. Even if it means we have to let go of what we had." Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest. "I understand," she whispered. "I'm so sorry, Luke. I don't know if I can ever make it right, but I want to try. For you. For Mia and Jack." Luke squeezed her hand gently, then let go, his expression thoughtful. "I don't think we can ever go back to what we were. But maybe we can build something new. As co-parents. As people who've learned from this. I don't know what that looks like yet, but I'm willing to find out." They both sat in silence, the weight of the conversation hanging in the air, but there was something else there too, an understanding. A recognition that while the past could never be erased, there was still a future to be shaped, even if it meant taking small steps toward something uncertain. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park, Evelyn and Luke stood up, their paths still uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, they felt like they were no longer walking alone. The days after their conversation in the park passed slowly, each one a mix of hope and hesitation. Luke and Evelyn had agreed to take small steps toward rebuilding their relationship, but neither of them knew exactly what that would look like. There was a quiet understanding between them, but also an awareness that the road ahead would be long and uncertain. They both wanted to move forward, but the pain of what had happened still loomed in the background, like an unspoken weight. Luke spent more time with Mia and Jack, trying his best to be a steady presence in their lives. He started volunteering at their school events, taking them on weekend outings and prioritizing their emotional needs above all else. The children had been through so much, and Luke knew that the best way to heal was to be there for them, even when his own heart was still fractured. But there were still moments when the house felt empty, when the absence of Evelyn's presence beside him was felt more deeply than ever. Evelyn, on the other hand, had begun to reflect more on her own actions and choices. She still stayed in her small apartment, but the loneliness was becoming unbearable. Her relationship with Ben had fizzled out as she had known it would. She realized that the attention and affection she had sought in him could never replace the deep connection she had once shared with Luke. But it wasn't just about Ben, it was about herself. She had been lost for so long, unable to ask for help, too afraid to admit that she had lost her way. The guilt over her affair with Ben still gnawed at her, and she knew it was something she couldn't easily undo. One evening, a few weeks after their conversation, Evelyn reached out to Luke again. She asked if they could meet to talk about their progress, about what had changed since they last spoke. Luke agreed, though a part of him was unsure of what to expect. He had started to accept the idea of moving on, of finding a new way to live separately but still share responsibilities as parents. But he wasn't sure if he was ready to dive deeper into the emotional complexity of their past. They met at a small cafe near the kids' school. The place was quiet, with soft jazz music playing in the background. As soon as Evelyn arrived, she seemed different. There was a calmness about her, an openness that hadn't been there before. "Hi," she said, her voice soft but steady. She smiled at him, but it was a smile that seemed filled with both sadness and understanding. "Hey," Luke replied, his voice guarded, unsure of how to approach her. They sat down at a corner table, the warm light from the overhead lamp casting soft shadows on their faces. "I've been thinking a lot," Evelyn began, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup. "About everything. About us, about what we've been through. I don't expect things to magically get better, Luke. But I need you to know that I'm trying. I'm trying to be the person I should have been all along, the person you deserved." Luke listened quietly, his gaze steady. He could hear the sincerity in her voice, but the wounds of betrayal were still fresh in his heart. He wanted to believe her, but the doubts lingered. "I'm glad you're trying," Luke said, his voice steady but distant. "But it's not easy for me, Evelyn. I'm not sure if I can ever trust you the way I did before. Trust is something I can't just give back after it's been broken. It's going to take time." Evelyn nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. "I know. I don't expect you to just forgive me, not overnight. But I'm willing to put in the work, Luke. For us. For the kids. I want to be better, not just for you but for myself." The words lingered in the air, and for a moment, Luke felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps it was possible for them to rebuild, not as a married couple, but as two people who had learned from their mistakes. Maybe they could find a way to coexist in a way that didn't feel like they were holding on to something that was already gone. "I've been focusing on the kids," Luke said, breaking the silence. "They need me more than ever, and I'm doing everything I can to be there for them. I've realized that's the most important thing right now." Evelyn smiled, a small, genuine smile. "You're a great father, Luke. They're lucky to have you." Luke met her gaze and nodded, though the ache in his chest never fully went away. There was still a distance between them, an invisible wall built from years of unspoken words, of emotional neglect, of betrayal. But for the first time, Luke didn't feel the need to break it down all at once. He wasn't ready to rebuild everything, but he was willing to start with small steps, with honest conversations, with trying to understand what they could still offer each other, even if it was just as co-parents. "I don't know where this is going, Evelyn," Luke said quietly, "but I'm willing to try. For the sake of our kids, for the sake of our family, I'm willing to try." Evelyn's eyes softened. "That's all I can ask for. We don't have to figure it all out today. I just want to be part of the solution, not part of the problem anymore." Luke exhaled slowly, feeling a weight lift off his chest. It wasn't a solution, not by any means, but it was a step in the right direction. They weren't going to magically fix everything overnight. They weren't going to go back to what they had before, but perhaps they could move forward, together but apart, finding a new way to be in each other's lives. As they parted ways that evening, Luke felt a small sense of peace settle over him. It wasn't the peace of a healed relationship, but the peace of acceptance. He didn't know what the future held, but he was willing to take it one day at a time. Back at home, Luke tucked Mia and Jack into bed, giving them extra hugs and kisses. He wasn't sure if everything would be okay, but he knew one thing. He would do whatever it took to make sure they felt loved, stable, and supported. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was taking steps toward healing, not just for himself but for them. Evelyn too felt the quiet weight of hope. It wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be a perfect path. But it was a start. And for the first time, she felt like she could face the future without the shame of the past overshadowing everything. She could rebuild, not with the expectation of returning to the old, but with the hope that she could become someone better. Someone who could stand tall with integrity and honesty, and offer her children a future grounded in love and respect. Both of them had learned painful lessons, but the journey toward healing had begun. And for now that was enough. Months passed since Luke and Evelyn had begun their slow, tentative journey toward healing. The quiet conversations and small steps they had taken together began to form a fragile understanding between them. Neither of them expected things to be perfect, far from it. But the emotional distance that once felt insurmountable now seemed a little less daunting. With time, they had come to accept that their relationship would never be the same, but they could still find a way to move forward. Luke had thrown himself into fatherhood, focusing all of his energy on Mia and Jack. He found solace in the simplicity of their daily routines, in the laughter that filled their home, and in the moments of connection he had longed for. He was learning how to be present, not just physically but emotionally, and how to prioritize the things that truly mattered. Mia and Jack had become his anchors, the steady force that helped him navigate through the uncertainty of his own feelings. Evelyn too had taken her own steps toward healing. She continued her work as a teacher, pouring her heart into her students as she tried to make up for the years she had spent neglecting her own emotional well-being. In her small apartment, she started to rebuild herself, not in the way she had hoped or imagined but in a way that felt more authentic. She began seeing a therapist, working through the guilt and shame she carried from the affair, learning how to be kinder to herself and how to rebuild her sense of self-worth. Though the path was difficult, Evelyn started to believe that she could create a future where she wasn't defined by her mistakes. Their co-parenting arrangement was still in its early stages, but it was working. Luke and Evelyn communicated regularly about the kids' schedules, school events, and milestones. They had learned to keep their conversations focused on what was best for Mia and Jack, setting aside their personal history for the sake of their children's well-being. They shared holidays, alternating time with the kids, and were careful to maintain a united front for their sake. The tension that once defined their interactions had slowly given way to a newfound respect, even if it was hard one. One afternoon, as they sat together at the kitchen table planning Jack's upcoming birthday party, Evelyn looked up at Luke. He was scribbling down notes for the guest list, his expression focused and calm. For a moment, Evelyn was struck by how different he seemed from the man she had confronted months ago. There was still a sadness in his eyes, but there was also a quiet strength, a resilience that hadn't been there before. "You've really done an amazing job with the kids," Evelyn said softly, breaking the silence. Luke looked up from his notes, surprised by the compliment. He had grown used to focusing on the practical aspects of parenting, on making sure the kids were okay. Hearing her acknowledge it felt strange, but in a good way. "They've been my priority," Luke said, his voice steady. "I want to make sure they know they're loved, that they're stable, that they don't have to carry any more of the weight of this than they already have." Evelyn nodded, her eyes softening. "I know. I see it, Luke. They're lucky to have you." Luke felt a pang of warmth at her words, but he quickly suppressed it, focusing instead on the task at hand. "We're lucky to have them," he replied. Their conversation shifted back to the party planning, and the moment passed, but for the first time in a long while, Luke felt a sense of ease in Evelyn's presence. It wasn't the same ease they once shared, but it was something different, a mutual understanding, a respect that had grown out of the rubble of their broken marriage. Later that evening, as they put Mia and Jack to bed together, Luke paused in the hallway watching Evelyn with the kids. There was a quiet affection in the way she interacted with them, a tenderness that he hadn't seen in a long time. He knew that their journey was far from over, but in that moment, he allowed himself to feel a small sense of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild something that was strong enough to endure. Evelyn, too, was starting to see the potential for a new kind of connection. She had no illusions about their past, but she had come to terms with the fact that the relationship they once had was gone. They couldn't go back to that, and they shouldn't. But what they could build now was something more grounded, more real, a partnership based on mutual respect, honesty, and shared responsibility. One evening, as she sat at her kitchen table, sipping tea and reflecting on how far they had come, Evelyn received a message from Luke. It was a simple text, just a check-in about the kids' plans for the weekend, but there was something in the way it was written, something that made Evelyn smile. Asterisk, you're doing great, Evelyn. Just wanted to say that. The kids are lucky to have you. Asterisk. For the first time in months, Evelyn felt a sense of peace wash over her. Luke's words weren't an attempt to fix anything or undo the past. They were just a recognition of the effort she had put in, of the steps she had taken to be a better person, not just for the family but for herself. As she put her phone down, Evelyn thought about the path ahead. It was still uncertain, still filled with challenges, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was moving forward in a way that was healthy. She was rediscovering herself, and she was learning how to be a better mother, a better person, and maybe even, someday, a better partner. Luke, too, had come a long way. He had found strength in his role as a father, and in the process, he had rediscovered parts of himself that had been lost in the shuffle of work, marriage, and life's demands. He wasn't the same man he had been when he first discovered Evelyn's betrayal, but he was becoming someone stronger, more self-aware. The scars from the past would always be there, but they didn't define him. In the months that followed, they both continued their separate journeys, one focused on being the best parent they could be, and the other learning to let go of past mistakes and embrace a new future. And though they didn't know what that future looked like, they knew they were moving in the right direction. The truth was, they might never be the same again. Their marriage had ended, and the life they had built together had crumbled. But in the rubble they had found something new, something real. And that was enough.